everyone for coming. It's great to see a terrific turnout for our last conversation of the term. As some of you may recall, this has been a conversation, this has been part of a class called Rebuilding America. It started with a phone conversation that I had with some folks in Senator Welch's office. Gosh, it must have been sometime over the summer when we were talking about what kinds of ideas might be generated around rebuilding the country when folks are ready to rebuild the country, and what kinds of things need to be done. And so this is really what we've done over the past 7 weeks is really just the tip of the iceberg. The students have been, we started with Congressman Jimmy Raskin, who talked about the January 6th Commission, who talked about truth. We had a really interesting conversation a couple weeks ago with our own governor, Governor Scott, about civility in politics. We had a remarkably interesting and enlightening conversation around education policy. And students have been really engaged in asking questions, and I think our folks that have been visiting with us have been incredibly informative. So I just want to thank the students who have been involved, and certainly our guests who Elliot will be introducing soon. And I'm just excited to wrap up the term with a really interesting dynamic conversation around the state of political parties now and where things are going to be headed. And my final thing before Elliot introduces, I can tell you everybody here, they are remarkable individuals. However, in the interest of time, we're not going to go sort of from the moment they came out all the way to today. So we're just going to do a couple of little things. But if anybody feels as though they aren't getting their due, please add whatever you like. You hear that, Robert? Okay. Because I know Robert has had a remarkable career with Hillary and Biden and all sorts of folks, and we're just mentioning a little bit. So with that, I am going to pass things over to Elliot. And then Savante will lead the conversation with his guests, and then we'll open up our conversation. Elliot, you're on. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you again for coming to tonight's discussion. My name is Elliot Wiersma. I'm a sophomore here at Bennington College. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guests with us this evening. First off, I'd like to welcome Mr. Savante Merrick. Mr. Merrick became the youngest ever mayor of the city of Ithaca, New York, at the age of 24 in 2012. Following his graduation from Cornell University. He was re-elected in 2015 and again in 2019 and assumed the role as president and CEO of People for the American Way, a nonprofit progressive advocacy group, in 2023. Second, I'd like to welcome Mr. Rob Flaherty. Mr. Flaherty graduated from Ithaca College in 2013 and kicked off his career working on campaigns within New York State. In fact, one of his first accomplishments was helping to get Mr. Merrick elected while he was still a junior in college.
By the way, I should mention all these West New York folks did not get into Bennington, unfortunately. That's why they ended up at Ithaca in Cornell.
Indeed.
It's nicer weather there.
He eventually went on to serve as the deputy campaign manager for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign in 2024. Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Shaniqua McClendon. Ms. McClendon serves as the Vice President for Politics for Crooked Media, a progressive political media company founded in 2017. She received a BA in Journalism and Mass Communications and a BS in Business Administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she received her Master's in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. And finally, I'd like to welcome Mr. Jeff Stein. Mr. Stein serves as the Chief Economics Correspondent for the Washington Post. Since joining in 2017, he's covered a whole host of topics, including Republican tax law, the government shutdown, and the administration's economic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We'd like to thank you all so much for joining us here at Bennington College this evening. We're very happy to have you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation we're going to have tonight.
Thank you.
They build sophomores differently nowadays. Thanks for that very kind introduction, Elliot, into Bennington and the Bennington community. Thanks for allowing me to come back here. Thanks also for your dedication to what I think is an extremely important topic. And I know you're dedicated to it because Brian and the college were very kind enough to let me stay here in an apartment about 15 feet away. And I don't think I'm going to make it back there tonight. It's that cold. So the fact that you came here shows a level of dedication and hardiness that those of us from the North Country have come to expect. I am really thrilled to talk about this topic. Thrilled to imagine a world beyond Trump. Not just because I'm not the biggest fan of the guy. Is that fair to say? Not the biggest fan of the guy. But just, two, because he has dominated in a very singular way our politics and our civil life for over a decade. Those of you who are students, so he came down that escalator in 2015. He'd already been up to a bunch of burglarism stuff before that, but in 2015 he came down that escalator. Those of you who are students, how old were you in 2015? 11, 12, okay. So this is really, boy, that sucks. He's defined, in both inside and outside of the presidency, what we believe to be possible. Now, I've invited 3 people I respect dearly, and they also happen to be very good friends of mine, here, because each of them has a unique experience. Shaniqua's work on the Hill and in the Obama White House, now with, I think, the largest and most successful progressive media company and podcast network in the country. Her experience with frontline campaigning could inform us about what's coming next. Jeff actually is very fascinating for many reasons. Jeff and I are friends now, but we were frenemies once. Because when I was elected to City Council in Ithaca, I was 20, he was the managing director of the Cornell Sun. So I don't know if you know those politicians in the media. And he was even then the most talented reporter I'd ever met. And it's no surprise that from working at Vox to the Washington Post, he succeeded. But here's what's fascinating. As the chief economics correspondent for the Washington Post, I mean, we were getting burritos a few months ago in DC, and he's like, sorry, I have to take this, it's Wilbur Ross. I'm like, well, that's not. I'll explain who Wilbur Ross is later. Or I won't, it doesn't matter. The point is that the amount of access that he has had to a particular Republican orbit through that work could be instructive about what comes next in a country without Trump. But, of course, that is not where Jeff's heart and passion lies. In fact, is it okay if I mention? It's okay if I mention? Since last week, he's like, can you come to my party? You'd be the second coolest mayor there, because Zoran's coming too. So Jeff is taking a leave from the Washington Post to write the definitive biography of Bernie Sanders, who's somebody who's been close to Jeff's heart and very close to his inner circle for over a decade now. So I think those two perspectives, the left and the economic right, could be very interesting. And I do love, anytime I can sneak into Rob Flaherty's resume that he worked for me when he was 20 years old, because no other rational human would put that on his resume. Ever since he ran social media for Hillary Clinton when he was, I don't know, 22, Beto O'Rourke, the Biden administration, and was the digital director and special assistant to the president during the Biden administration. And of course, when the campaign turned over to Kamala, built some of the most impressive campaign infrastructure that the world's ever seen. So I have some questions for you guys. And I want to start with the positive. That is one assumption, an assumption that there is actually coming soon a world without Trump. That seems common sense, right? Because he's in the second term, but there's all sorts of, and we'll get to that later, there's all sorts of questions being led by Steve Bannon about whether or not he could actually run for a third term. About, of course, not even running for a third term, but instead sowing enough chaos, announcing that there are such an emergency at the border or with China or with whatever, that he can't allow the country to go through elections this cycle. Of course, most states won't go with it, but only 2 or 5 or 7 would have to go along for us to hold an election, only 43 states vote, and then what? Then he'll say that's not a legitimate election, how do you pry and loosen? And then we're not even going to talk about his sons because he rarely talks about his sons, so we won't do that. But let's assume for the beginning part of our conversation that we are headed towards life beyond Trump. That as he moves towards this midterm cycle, he will be entering lame duck status. I want to ask each of you in turn about what you're seeing, and actually, if you don't mind, I'll be more specific. Rob, I want to ask you about the Democrats ahead of 26 and 2028. Rob is one of the most sought after campaign staffers on the planet. People are pitching him to come join their campaigns. Yeah, but it's, okay, I'm saying it so he doesn't have to. If you want to know who's running for president, just check his phone logs, because they're asking him to come join us. The question for Rob, and then I'll cue it up for each of you. As people are positioning themselves, what do you think the normie center-left part of the Democratic Party is planning for in 2028? What do you think they think the opportunities are? Then I'll ask you, Shaniqua, as those who work on the front lines to organize voters and get them out, what do you think people are most passionate to see in a post-Trump America? What will keep people to actually knock on doors? And Jeff, I really actually want to start not with the left, but with the right. I do think Trump has held together this very diverse coalition of foreign policy hawks and foreign policy doves, of free market believers and whatever it is we're doing now, we're nationalizing industries and stuff. Social conservatives, as well as, and when his power personality is gone, what battles do you see emerging in that party? So, Rob, if it's okay, I'll start with you, and then Shaniqua and Jeff.
Great. Well, thank you, Svante, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I imagine it's cold. I'm in DC. I have a 3-month-old. I felt like I would get in trouble if I fled the coop for the night. So I'm a little warmer, I guess. I think the first way to answer a question about like where are normie Democrats right now is like, what is a normie Democrat? I think a little bit of like the party's coalition is changing in a few ways. One, I think there's a general consensus that like people want fighters, not folders. They are pissed. They want people who are gonna sort of stand up and stop and all this stuff, all the excesses of the Trump administration. I think that is manifesting in a few ways, which is one, the sort of like base of the party is, I think their patience with institutional Washington Democrats has really grown thin. They don't care what Chuck Schumer has to say or what candidates are being foisted on them by Washington. They want people who are going to stand up, pick a fight. I think that is playing out as we think about candidate selections and primaries right now and sort of who's up and who's down. But I think it's also playing out in sort of the early trials of 2028 where you see Newsom sort of running up the score. Not in a hugely significant way, but he's out front in a lot of polling, really purely because he's just sort of taken an aggressive anti-Trump posture, probably a lot more loudly than many of the others. But I do think this question of like, what is a normal Democrat and what is a normie Democrat is complex. In many ways, I think the most useful way to think about this moment is less sort of left versus right and more like top up versus down, right? Up being sort of pro-institutional, no kings, sort of stand with democracy, and down being sort of anti-institutional, disaffected, yada, 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 that sort of corner. And so there's interesting stuff happening in both directions, right? You have people whose sort of material conditions are better, who care more about protecting America's institutions, and you have people whose material conditions are worse, who are saying blow up the system. And also, like, what is a normie Democrat? Is a normie Democrat suburban wine mom at this point, or is it the 70-year-old black women in South Carolina who are probably going to decide the presidential, right? And those folks all kind of want different things, which I think is what makes managing the Democratic Party coalition pretty complex. Obviously, we had good news, and if you hear a baby crying in the background, I apologize. It's bedtime. Obviously, the 26 elections or 25 elections were good. They portend good stuff for the 26 elections, but I think we are still at a point where we don't have a winning presidential coalition yet, and someone's going to have to build one. And I think that will be one of the core challenges of the next 3 years.
Nice. Thank you, Rob. Pretty good noise suppression on Zoom these days, but I could still hear Arthur. He's loud and proud back there. Shaniqua, what are you hearing, particularly about the issues? What issues now are going to be animating people as we, as Brian said, rebuild? Where do folks want to start? What do they care about? What's different from even a year ago election time?
And I also want to answer the question you actually asked before.
I did not.
Those together.
I can ask several questions. Do I contradict myself?
No, I think it's actually the same. You just mentioned kind of like what's going to get people out to want to knock doors and kind of participate. And I think it's the same thing that gets people to want to vote. When we, so Crooked Media launched, or was created in 2017, and I came on in 2018 to launch our Vote Save America program, which mobilizes our audience to give money, knock doors, and what we now like to say is like be mini messengers for progressives. But we saw a tremendous amount of energy in 2018. And part of that was, of course, people wanted to get Donald Trump out of office. But 2018, you also saw the most diverse House of Representatives, or group in the Democratic caucus be elected to the House of Representatives. And there were a lot of exciting candidates there who appealed to a lot of different people. And of course part of it was they wanted to kind of go up against Trump, but another part of it was they represented a new direction for the Democratic Party, and people were excited to get out and do something to help those folks get elected. I think we also saw the opposite of that in 2020, in 2024, quite frankly. That was the lowest participation we've seen since we started Vote Save America and people wanting to get involved until you saw that switch at the top of the ticket. I do think the White House was talking about most of the things that voters cared about, but they didn't feel like anything was actually being fixed. And there's kind of like this art, or I don't want to just call it vibes, but there's a bit of vibes to how voters feel, and the same people who want to kind of get out and get those people out to vote. And that wasn't there until we saw the switch at the top of the ticket, and then we saw people flooding in wanting to help take action for Kamala Harris. And so I think now, we look back to the elections a few weeks ago, the same thing that was centered, and many people think helped Donald Trump get elected in November last year, is the cost of living. I think something that really plagued the Biden White House is on paper, the economy was good, but people were not feeling that. And you can't trick someone out of how they feel. You can't trick someone out of the fact that they're spending more on groceries, housing, all these things. And so even though the steps were being taken to improve things, voters are not that generous with how much time they give you to fix those things. And so now we're in the Trump administration, and I think we'll continue to see cost of living be the main thing that people are focused on. I mean, as we all know, Zohran Mamdani focused on it a lot in his mayoral race in New York, but it's also what people like Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill focused on as well. And we actually got involved in the Public Service Commission races in Georgia, which are these statewide races, and it's a commission that helps set prices, utility prices in Georgia. And it had a Republican majority, but they continued to vote yes to raise rates on residents in Georgia. And they saw a tremendous turnout in that election, this kind of random election that people don't really pay attention to, because the focus was on the fact that if you keep these folks in office, they're going to continue to tell the or the utility companies that it's fine to raise your rates. And so I think that will continue to be a big issue. But I also think the undercurrent of it is people are paying attention to the deterioration of our democracy. We're working on this campaign with Stacey Abrams called 10 Steps, and something she's been kind of weaving in this campaign is how do you relate, steps towards authoritarianism with the way that they impact people's everyday lives. And I think as those things start to merge together more for people, we'll see both of those things start to matter. And an example that she used that I thought was really good was, you have Donald Trump, firing the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and kind of, we're not seeing as much economic data as we should be about what's going on. But if we cannot prove there's been an increase in the cost of living, then how will senior citizens get a COLA increase? And so really just linking those things together as people see their cost of living go up, that the decisions he's making to kind of like assume all this power and control will actually have an impact on the things that affect people every day.
So thank you all so much for being here. I'm in the process of writing a book, which typically involves like 14 hours of me alone staring at a computer, so seeing human faces is a nice change of pace. Svante asked, I think, a great question about sort of what does the Republican coalition look like after Trump? And as a journalist who stubbornly refused to write all of the demands that Svante imposed on me as mayor, I'm going to ignore his question, take this slightly in my own direction.
And the thing is, I filled more potholes. I filled the potholes and they didn't. We'll pick us up. That's 07 beef. That's old beef. That's old.
Yeah. I think to answer the question of what the post-Trump Republican coalition looks like, we have to understand what enabled Trump to take over the Republican Party to begin with, which has obviously been the subject of a ton of debate, a ton of research, a ton of discussion. The thesis of my book that I'm leaning towards, and you guys can tell me if this tracks with your experience or what you think of it, but over the course of the post-war period in America, really from the New Deal until Trump's election, you saw a process by which the political system became increasingly controlled by a small financial elite that then used their control over economic resources to expand their control over political power, and therefore used that power that they accumulated to expand their economic power, which created a self-reinforcing cycle. And there were elections, there were swings.
Now, can you do it in the Brooklyn accent? Can you do it in the Bernie accent?
I came to this theory on my own, actually. I'm the first person to say this. And I dealt, frankly, and we can discuss this because it was quite tense in the moment. Under Biden, I was a reporter at the Post, writing a lot of stories about how people were very, very upset about the cost of living. And I got angry, bitter, ferocious calls from Biden staffers telling me I didn't understand the data, I didn't know what I was talking about, and now most Democrats are quite aligned on the idea that there is an affordability crisis in America, which, there have been some changes to the material economy since Biden left and Trump took office, but fundamentally the data is pretty similar. The reason I bring that up is to say that over the course of the post-war period into what I oversimplistically think of as the neoliberal age, Clinton, Bush, Reagan, you saw this process of control over the political system and the economic system to a point at which, in 2015 and 2016, the vast majority of Republican voters were telling pollsters that they had deep concerns about Donald Trump's temperament, about his fitness for office, about his comments about women, and yet they voted for him anyway. And so the question, I think, that's going to be imperative for the post-Trump Republican Party is, to what extent can another generation of Republican politicians sort of absorb, respond to, co-opt, or reject elements of Trump's sort of inchoate, incomplete, half-hearted efforts to reject sort of capital's control over the political system. And I think it's a complicated subject that people get very heated about very quickly for understandable reasons, because while it is the case that Trump has demonstrated and benefited from signs that he is unwilling to follow sort of what the political elites were doing in the Bush and Reagan years, on trade in particular, but also on currency policy, on even the tariffs a little bit. There are things that are outside of GOP orthodoxy that big business really hates that Trump does, and I don't think it's a slander to the Democratic Party to say that those things are meaningful breaks from the political demands of capital. At the same time, Trump also authorized something that Democrats would never do, which was the single biggest transfer of wealth upwards in American history through the One Big Beautiful Bill approved recently, which cut over $1 trillion in Medicaid for poor, low-income households and massively expanded tax cuts for the rich. So you put that all together, Trump took a step outside of what the Republican Party had been, and so does the next Republican candidate, does J.D. Vance, is he able to recreate the Trump coalition by further attempting to represent a break from what came before? So that's an incoherent answer, but...
No, that's extremely fascinating. So let me get more specific. Can he, JD? And is he the next candidate? And if not him, who could? On the economic side, because there's all sorts of other contradictions within the party that will have to be answered, but is there another candidate that you could see on the Republican side who could pick up this mantle of what I would call, as a partisan, false populism, but
No.
yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think the tax bill is evidence that it is, yeah, that there is nothing populist about cutting healthcare for 15 million people. But if you can make the issue be about China and about their currency practices and about trade with bad foreigners, that is something that Trump has done, I think, quite effectively, and really Democrats haven't quite figured out how to deal with that. I think Tucker Carlson is really aware of the dynamics I've outlined. And, Steve Bannon was really at the forefront of a charge that a lot of Democrats made fun of me for reporting, and I will say they were right about, because I broke a story.
Write that down, Rob.
During the One Big Beautiful Bill that that basically Bannon and a few other people were pushing Trump to increase taxes on the 1% as part of that tax bill and not cut Medicaid. And I wrote that story, and I think Svante was like, you are like Charlie Brown, Steve Bannon's the football, or he's holding the football.
Steve Bannon's Lucy.
Steve Bannon's Lucy.
Yeah, the football is the promise of economic equality.
Thank you, Tom.
So wait, later students, Wilbur Ross and Charlie Brown, we'll talk about that.
No, and I guess what I'm trying to say is
Now Holly,
Holly,
wrote that.
yeah.
Right, he wrote that up.
But
is he going for it?
I guess I would defend my questionable reporting decisions on the basis of, like, something was happening there. Like, there are some people in the Republican Party who are like, if we coalesce around a more, like, around sort of anti-immigrant, anti-China, but not, like, huge breaks for billionaires agenda, like, that is potentially really potent.
I will just plus one that. As
I want to hear.
Normie Democrat. I will just say, to me, Tucker Carlson is their scariest candidate in a really interesting way. I think he has made. If you watch what he says about young people being able to afford homes, if you watch what he says about Medicare, Medicaid, if you watch it, I mean, it wouldn't sound all that out of place in like an Elizabeth Warren speech, right? There is something that he is doing that I think is more interesting and more visceral and realer than certainly what J.D. Vance is going to do left to his own devices. So I would plus one that, to me actually that's the most threatening development going on right now.
Yeah, and he's good on TV, which is important for a candidate. Or can I ask?
I'm sorry, what was it that you said? I missed the name.
Tucker
Carlson, yeah.
Usually when I hear the name too, I get fuzzy in my ears. I try and self-censor. Rob, can I ask this? All right, so I was in DC on the 4th of July, and a B-52 stealth bomber flew overhead. Do you know these? Like, very cool, but creepy to see in person. It was like a shark in the air. I was like, what is that? Why is it here? So I go on Twitter to try and find out, but Twitter's useless now. So I went on to Threads and found out that Trump was signing the big, beautiful bill that took healthcare away from 15 million of, mostly, by the way, hit constituents in red states. Taking that healthcare away, phased, of course, to happen a year from the signing of the bill, so folks wouldn't connect the two. And he had timed the signing of the bill in the Rose Garden with a flyover from the exact plane that had bombed around, 2 weeks ago. And it was covered on Fox News like, guys, America's back, patriotism, jets, cool. Even I was like, jets are cool. But that, and the show overran the substance. But do you think on the Democratic side, is there anyone, and again, I'd ask specific candidates' names, just because I hate to say it, but we're getting to that time. Is there anyone who has this flair for the dramatic? This much of a nose for how to get the attention of the room and therefore push through their agenda?
Sante's leaving out that as mayor, he brought back Ithaca fireworks from the 4th of July. Is that right?
I'm so excited to tell you about it. Thank you for that segue. Yeah, big displays, I will confess, as Jeff knows, even people in Ithaca is, Ithaca voted more for Bernie than Burlington. We're left of, I guess we're Vermont moderates, I guess is what you call us. Very progressive, but I'm big on symbols, very big on symbols. That's why I work at People for the American Way now. It's founded by Norman Lear, with All in the Family and the Jeffersons, the Sanford and Sons, in this attempt to take back the flag and patriotism. I really believe that these symbols can communicate more than white papers can. So I've watched with some envy what the right has been able to do. I would say, again, as a partisan, to hoodwink people that thinking that they're on the side using these powerful symbols. Well, do you think that the Democratic Party has gotten that message, and in particular, are there any future candidates you think will be as good at this as Trump was?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't think, I think the worst thing you can do in the face of Donald Trump is to try to just copy it and do what he's doing, right? I do not think it is good to do extremely gaudy gold decorations and, I don't know, I think that on the question of attention and sort of having an understanding of the flair for the dramatic, yeah, I mean, look, I think, again, like I mentioned, Newsom earlier, he's done a good job at that. I think there's different people who have, but that is one style of getting attention, right? I mean, that is, picking a fight and having sort of a loud social media presence. I don't know that is the only way that you can have a sense of attention getting. I think John Ossoff does really interesting stuff. I mean, he's not playing a volume game. He pops up infrequently and says something really interesting that breaks through, right? Like that's different. I think that what is generally happening in the party is this. I think you see a lot of people who are trying to substitute aesthetics for substance, right? Like they watch Zoran Mamdani and they go, oh, well, we got to do YouTube videos and go on a lot of podcasts and all that stuff. And the reality is that stuff works because of stuff you do offline, right? Like Newsom can get away with his social presence because he's actually picking a fight with Trump and winning. Zoran can get away with all the stuff that he's doing on social, and there's wind behind it because he has a message that's resonating with people. And so, I think we're way over towards like swearing in tweets and begging Joe Rogan to let us go on their show and not on like thinking about what is actually making a difference in people's lives.
And so you're saying, Rob, he's still not gonna let me on the show?
We'll keep asking.
We'll keep asking. Shaniqua, this is a weighty one to then, I want to ask you a question that's quite specific, and then I want to open it up for questions, discussion. And it's about Israel and Palestine. For decades, there has been little daylight between the Democratic and Republican Party on support for Israel and the peace process, and then the wars and the invasions. What are you seeing on the ground? How many races do you intend to support this year?
Probably like, I don't know, 60.
60 House races and Senate races.
Oh, yes, well, it'll be some down ballot stuff.
And down ballot. What are you saying? I'd actually love to know what both of you think about this. What shifts are you saying for the Democrats running for office, and what could that mean for the future of the conflict in Israel and Palestine?
So it's interesting. I went to a fundraiser in 2019 in LA. It was like a Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee fundraiser, and Chris Murphy was there. And it wasn't in front of everyone. I just kind of asked him directly, and the reason I asked, when I was in grad school, I went on a trip.
Where?
Harvard, right?
Yes.
He makes this big
She
deal. Okay.
She tries to not say it.
I went to Harvard for grad school, okay. And, they organize these student trips, and so some Palestinian students organized a trip to Palestine, and so it was still just very fresh for me 2 years later. And I asked him, do you think there's going to be a shift at some point amongst Democrats where there isn't just kind of like, a blank check that goes out without some strings attached to the money that we're sending to Israel to protect themselves? And he said, I think something's starting to change. And I think if you fast forward to, a few years ago with October 7th, that was the first time, to me it felt like the country at large was seeing what I saw when I went there, which was, and granted, the trip was organized by Palestinians who lived on the ground there and were at school with me, and so I recognized that we were getting kind of that version of events, but that version of events had really, just kind of unfiltered things happen. I saw a 13-year-old boy kneeling down on the ground with his hands behind his head and a gun to his head from an IDF soldier, and so, I saw that, and I think after we start seeing the images coming out of Palestine in the midst of this war, people saw images that they hadn't even really factored in before. I don't think most Americans even understood to the level they do now what was happening between Israel and Palestine. I don't think most people understood, what a settlement was, or just kind of the constant conflict that was happening that might not have reached the definition of a war, but was just always happening there. And I think now that so many people, particularly young people, care about this issue, and I think that's coinciding with, since 2018, seeing more young people participate in or in elections generally. I think we've been, not we, but I've heard a lot of people say over the years, oh, the young people are not going to keep voting at the rates that they have been. But they have, relative to young people in the past. And so I think this is going to be an issue that continues to take up more and more space on our side. And I actually think it's going to become a bit of a litmus test on the Democratic side. There will be some places where voters are just only focused on, what's happening in their wallets or in their living rooms. But I think as young people are continuing to care about this, it's hard for them to want to hear Democrats talk about the ideals and values they believe in and think that the conflict between Israel and Palestine can be separate from that. And I think we've started to see a lot of politicians kind of be pushed on this when they are having so many things coinciding. You're seeing more politicians go on podcasts because that was the big craze after 2024, but they're not receiving this same kind of questioning a traditional kind of access journalist might present to them because they want them to come back, and they're struggling to answer these questions. And so even, Jasmine Crockett just announced that she's running for Senate, and I was not expecting to see all the blowback that, I think people have admitted she hasn't taken any money from AIPAC, which seemed like that was the first kind of litmus test, but now it's shifting to, and we were talking about this earlier, I think we're getting into this murky place on the left where there's some completely fine commentary and, inquiry about our support for Israel, but then it can sometimes veer into anti-Semitism. And yeah, any new person who comes up, it seems they're being hit with that. So I don't know that we're going to have a clear answer on kind of like how people are supposed to answer, because there seems to be an expectation of a wide range of answers, but I think it's something that Democrats are going to have to create some daylight between themselves and Republicans on to actually get as a primary.
Same question, to say briefly, because I do want to, let's take this time and get into Q&A. Jeff and Robert, specific, in 08, which is the first presidential campaign I could vote in, Obama was not in it. It was Hillary and John Edwards, and the Obama thing was fascinating, exciting, but he wasn't going to win. And then the vote to authorize the war in Iraq became a litmus test. And Hillary, of course, he voted for it. Obama wasn't in the Senate to vote for it, but he said that he had a question. And that gave him a boost, particularly amongst the left. Does this issue rhyme with that? And if so, what does that mean for the election and beyond?
Is my Jewish mother in the room?
Always, but always.
All the polling data seems incredibly clear to me. Voters in the Democratic Party, voters in the Republican Party, voters in neither party, particularly young voters, are fucking pissed about all the money we've been sending to Israel and all the casualties that have resulted. And I think it, at the risk of being like a crude Marxist,
Too late.
it comes back to the question of money, because, and I think I almost have the good fortune of having Stein in my last name, that, and of being a practicing, mostly a Jew, that enables me to...
You'll perfect it soon.
Just say that, there's a clear connection between the amount of money by a small number of donors who have flooded our political system that may be tapping into, in part, something that is non-economic, but is certainly part of the reason that our political class, by every conceivable measure, seems so far from the vast majority of the public.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you would see in focus groups and polling, I mean, to Jeff's point, the sort of consistent thing you would hear when you would talk to voters, swing voters in any particular way, is this idea of things cost too much here. My world is not getting better, and we are sending a lot of money abroad to Ukraine, we are sending it to Israel, we are sending it across the world, and why. And so I think even taking the question of Israel out of it, there is just a less of an appetite right now for foreign engagements in general in the country because of material conditions back home. So against that backdrop, you have the conflict in the Middle East, which I do think is probably going to play out similarly in this primary in a way that the Iraq War did. But I think that it is more complicated than the Iraq. Well, it's not more complicated than the Iraq War. It is complicated in the sense that there is still a huge part of the politically important part of the coalition who has either nuanced or supportive views of what is going on. And so I think you're going to see a lot of candidates take a lot of different positions, but I think the incentives are going to be towards, being harder and harsher against the Israeli government. I think you will see surprising candidates call it a genocide. You will see surprising candidates, call for significant strings against, the sales of weapons and the engagement there. I think it is going to definitely shade the primary. And what I'll say is that, it's not an issue that a lot of voters say is their top issue, but it is an issue that people view from a moral place, and it is an issue that they communicate on. And so as a practitioner, it is really, really hard to communicate through anything but the sort of least nuanced position on this. And so I think that's just going to be a really complicated factor for Democrats who are trying to navigate 2028. And, Shaniqua put it, well, which is, I am concerned both about the callousness that Democrats have had towards Palestinians, but I am also concerned about sort of real anti-Semitism that is growing and sort of spilling over in the way that people even talk about candidates. I think it's going to be a massive factor in the Democratic primary in 28, and I think it'll be a factor in the Republican primary too, and a challenge for everyone to navigate.
I've been really surprised. I've gone to maybe 10, 15 Bernie rallies. It's not like a Bernie issue. It is the #1 applause line, is Israel, Palestine stuff, which is not the reason you think people go to see Bernie. But people are fired up.
And I think you're right, it's both a moral question, which has urgency, but to Rob's point, it's also what you used to call virtue signaling, usually in a derogatory way, which is where you stand on this tells me if I can trust you on that. Which is, and Hillary's like, I want to expand healthcare. I'm like, no, you didn't care about Iraqis. I'm not so sure you care about us. So it became a virtue signaling issue.
Questions?
Yes,
from the audience.
questions.
Students, I know you've been thinking about this all the time.
Yes.
I'm wondering, you guys keep mentioning stuff about cost of living, right? I was taking this housing class next term, which was assessing sort of like the state of housing in Vermont, but also wider in like the nation. And I'm wondering, would you guys consider housing to be also a deeply pressing issue that people are worried about and would change their minds, would change their tickets over for? Or is it less imminent than say grocery prices and stuff like that? Or is it sort of like a humdrum? Is it like a crisis? How do people view this as a voter?
I think I think housing, and if you don't mind if I hop in here, because I've been moderating, but I have opinions. I spent the first 8 years of my life in a homeless shelter and ran for office to end homelessness in America. I think the hardest in my 10 years is my 14 years in office, and the hardest fights I ever fought, even in liberal life, was to build more affordable housing. There's people with Greenpeace stickers and Habitat for Humanity stickers who, when affordable housing was good, you would some lose me.
Stone Quarry?
Oh, don't. Even PTSD. People who support me all the way, supported Habitat for Humanity by donating, did not want affordable housing built on their block. It is extremely difficult and it's not an intractable issue, it's a solvable issue. The problem, I think, with housing as a political issue is that folks vote with how they are doing right now. So no matter who caused this crisis, Reagan, no matter who caused it, since Reagan, my people I grew up in Appalachia, who are struggling with the cost of housing, they voted against whoever's in office. Just voted against whoever's in office. H.W. Bush lost to Bill Clinton because these voters swung to him. They swung from Clinton, they said, I still can't afford housing, so they voted for Bush. They still can afford housing, so they voted for Obama. Still can afford housing, so they voted for Trump. Still can afford housing, so they voted for Biden. looking for housing facility voted for Trump. Because the issue of the high cost of housing requires the construction of more housing. That is a decision made at local levels and at state levels largely, and takes decades to do. And so folks vote out of frustration, but not towards an actual plan. And it's so easy for any politician to come in and say, housing costs are too high, I'm going to lower them. And you might not trust them, but you just say whatever's been working is working. I really hope, I really do hope that from Zoran to Trump, the one tie is a promise to lower the cost of living, and there's no bigger. Groceries are expensive, but nothing is more expensive than rent, and nothing is more crucial. Nothing is more crucial.
You can't raise the price of healthcare while you're trying to lower the cost of living. That's the one issue that.
Is healthcare, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but even the cost of healthcare, you know, half of all the money we'll spend on healthcare in our whole lives in the last 6 months of our lives. Everybody every month is putting out, in this country, between a third and half of their entire paycheck. And it is, I think it is breaking not only a lot of families, but it is breaking our trust in our civic institutions. It is this stressful, that the first of the month is this stressful, and that the effects of falling short are devastating. You know, there are things you can do at the grocery store, there's nothing you can do when you lose your home.
I agree with everything you're saying about the housing situation. I think a further real intractable political problem is that something like 55–60% of Americans are currently existing homeowners, right? So that means that the solution for the people who are not homeowners is to say to the 55% of people whose, because of our threadbare safety net, whose retirement, whose elder care, whose entire financial, their whole lives have gone into housing as more than a place to live, but as a vehicle for retirement. And obviously, as a millennial, I see all my friends and everyone, you know, like that the cost of living for young people is out of control, and we need to build houses. As sometimes I need to fix that. But the flip side of doing that is to deflate the value of people's nest eggs.
Yeah.
And
Or just slow the appreciation of it.
but that's a huge, that's...
And that's why, no, exactly, and that's why, listen, I think there is a hypocrisy at the heart of the Democratic Party that the voters can sense, if not put their finger on, that California has a homeless crisis, and Texas doesn't. New York has a homeless crisis, and Louisiana doesn't. And that it has been, Democrats have stifled housing growth, and we just don't have an answer for that right now, for why we did it or how we're going to stop doing it.
Does everyone feel better about it? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, this group around the table, come on. Yes, go ahead. We'll go around.
So you all talked a little bit earlier about sort of how the Democratic base currently wants sort of a fighter candidates. Do you all think, anybody can take this question, I guess, is there a difference between a winning policy platform that a candidate takes and a winning disposition? As in, like, for a candidate to win, should they have to adopt, you know, a fighter platform, one that's more progressive, like you've seen with Zoran, where you see this new populism emerging, where these candidates are really making hard, upfront pushes for a lot of the gets that the Democratic Party has stood for, a larger welfare state, things like that.
That's a good question. I guess, Shaniqua, in particular, your thoughts?
I think policy matters a lot, but it's just not the thing, unless it's just kind of like really direct. And I think we saw that with like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Zoran Mamdani, these really kind of 1, 2, 3, it's really clear what they stand for. But I also think we've seen with the Congresswoman, like, she's one member of the House and is in the minority right now. And I think we can even see in her behavior an understanding of what it actually means to be part of a legislative body. that not only right now are you not in the majority of, but the people who are in charge of your caucus are not necessarily where you are. But to win, I think it's a mix of both, but I think it is more about a disposition. Like, people have to feel something, and they have to be inspired to go vote for you. I remember when Maxwell Frost was elected, I moderated this panel, and one of the questions I had that I thought he answered better than any politician I've ever heard talk about this was kind of the way he ran for office and what he would be able to do as one member of Congress. And he said that he was actually pretty honest on the campaign trail with voters about how much power he actually had. And he felt like that bought him a lot of trust because they knew he would be fighting for these things, but did not have an expectation that tomorrow it would happen, because he would not be able to convince his entire caucus, much less the entire Congress, to get these things done. And I don't know how that meshes with a fighter if you have concessions about how much you can get done. But I do think there is something to be said about fighting even if you lose. And I think that's why a lot of people got upset when Democrats reopened the government and didn't walk away with healthcare subsidies. And, I've gone back and forth if that was the right thing to do. But Republicans are now voting on subsidies, and now it didn't pass, but the fact that it's even part of the conversation, I wonder if they could have gotten more out of them. But again, we saw all the backlash that Schumer got in March when he didn't even think about shutting down the government, and even in more recently where he, quote unquote, wasn't part of the group to reopen the government. But I think people just don't feel like he's fighting. So I think there's this mix of some transparency, but being caught trying, that will get people to care. And
It's just been my experience, there's 5 or 6 aspects of a campaign. When you're running a campaign, you see it quite direct because you have staff to do field, staff to do policy, staff to do comms, and then you have the candidate themselves and your finance. Each department believes that they're the only one that matters. That if we can nail the policy, everything else is fine. If we can nail the comms, everything else is fine. Because the candidate is the best, and the truth is, it's just, it all has to work. And it all has to work in a way that complements each other, that there's not a riff of hypocrisy or contradiction.
Can I just add, I started working in politics because I believe, I got interested in education policy. I don't know why I got so obsessed with No Child Left Behind not working. And I just believe policy is all that matters. And then I got to Capitol Hill and I was like, oh, all these other factors go into it. And so I used to be the legislative staffer who only believed that, but Samante's right, it's a mix of all those things.
Can I add one thing though, which I do think is, I am with you that the specific policies don't matter. I do think delivery matters, and what I mean by delivery is I don't know. I think I'm maybe more existentially depressed than many of my brethren, but we sort of I often think that we sort of view politics as well, this is how the game works. But I really think that we were sort of at a point where people have really had it with Democrats saying they're going to do stuff and not doing stuff, and in a way that is not just we're going to win the pendular or whatever arguments. And so I sort of view it as people care about values, and then they care about their lives getting better really fast. And Alyssa Slotkin, there was this thing she did where she said, we are not going to give tax breaks to companies who don't pay a minimum wage. And she kind of got roasted on Twitter for saying clunky shit. But I actually think that was so illustrative because Trump doesn't do that. So we go back to things Trump does well. Trump just says we should pay people a living wage. And then what he does when he gets in the government? He does rescissions. He does all kinds of crazy shit to just get what he needs done. And people, to Shaniqua's point, want to see you kind of get caught trying, but at least do something. And I think that Democrats come into this next election in sort of trust default, and so delivery, good values and delivery are going to matter a lot.
Maggie, you had your hand up.
So my question has to do with social media. So, Rob, if you want to answer, but also I'm sure everyone would have a great answer for this. Just sort of, social media was incredibly paramount in Trump's campaigns, and especially in creating this sort of like Arendt-defined leader of infallibility. And as we're anticipating emerging candidates for the Democratic Party in 2028, where do you expect the political landscape on social media specifically and the attention economy to lead?
Yeah, so I think there are three things going on that were going on in 2024, but that are all about to get supercharged. The first is everything's niches. It's like it's a niche now. Everything's personalized, right? So the internet sort of like is crafted for you. And so it means that there's no broadcast opportunities anymore that aren't football games. And so it just means that to go reach people, you have to go to more places to go reach them, right? And obviously just showing up in a place does not mean people are gonna like you. You have to say things that they like and get there, but like, that is like a thing. The second thing, and I could go on and on, I think AI is gonna be something that super defines 28. You know, I think people are way too focused on, like, will people have deep fakes and whatever, and sort of less focused on how users are gonna react to AI. I think between now and 28, you're gonna see increasing distrust on social platforms of the content, right? Because social media is dead. It's consumption zones and communication zones. People are going to be increasingly distrustful of the stuff they see in their feed because there's just more AI slop, things kind of get shitified. And so it's going to build a deeper importance on people's connections with individuals, right? So individual creators, individual talent, and individual candidates, right? The way you build these sort of like parasocial relationships. And then the third thing is like the inexorable, like, in the post-social world, social media has moved into private, right? So the vast majority of content on Instagram is shared in private. The user behavior on Snap has moved even further in the direction of like, you know, sort of private conversations, texting, all this stuff. And so like campaigns are gonna have to deal with all three of those things at once. In how they think about paid media, which still works, by the way, how they think about their organizing strategies, right? Because you have to get into these private spaces and you can't just sort of use the old Obama snowflake model to do that. You know, you're gonna have to go on more niche media, but like view the principles, like we spend time thinking about the principles time and how do they manipulate geographic areas, right? Like you do an event in this media market or whatever, but you have to think about interest areas. And then how you sort of build deeper connections with the candidate and principal through digital, and how you build deeper connections, and how you sort of leverage people's deeper connections with the people they do trust, I think is gonna be like 3 times as important. So those are things I think that are gonna sort of be the backdrop of how people think about social media as they go through, 28.
I'm sure Rob is right, but my bet is in 2026 that a really big thing will be nonfiction books. Books are coming out.
And the title is Bernie exclamation point coming out in 2026. Actually, The Art of Saving Democracy by People for the American Way will also be coming out. It's a book, but also an action kit. It's posters and stickers. Artists like Rauschenberg and Boucher, etc. We are at time. And I want to respect, I don't intend to ever go outside again, so I'll stay here for as long as possible, but I do.
Yeah, can we get Ollie and maybe one more after that? Yeah.
I was gonna ask you a question specifically. You spoke about how the Clinton administration, and the Bush and the Reagan administration, like having been a factor in the Republican Party's history, was a driving factor in like Republicans' criticism of Trump, but then people still voted for him anyway. That made me kind of think about the kind of like cognitive dissonance that we see on a lot of college campuses nowadays, and how certain far-right groups and certain faith-based far-right groups like Turning Point USA, for example, are taking advantage of that and situating themselves more on college campuses and holding more of a presence in youth spaces. So how do you think, decades from now maybe, that kind of influence on young people from the far right that is also being inflated and now, being put into like Texas school curriculums, how do you think that will affect the future of the Republican Party and also just like my generation's presence in our government?
I'm not sure this answers your question, but I think there's, to go back to what we were discussing earlier,
There was
yeah, please.
sorry, and specifically more not just the role in the government, but like the future of like socially beneficial legislation and policy.
I mean, I think to go back to the Israel conversation, there's an accurate thing that's being diagnosed by young people right now, that sort of the mainstream figures that purport to represent them and speak to them are not doing so. And I think the danger now, as it was with, 2015, 2016, is that, how many people here have been following Candace Owens recently? She's apparently been having some really interesting dreams about solving the Charlie Kirk murder. And the reason I bring that up is because...
Wait, but that's actually instructive. Does anybody, raise your hand if you've been following.
Do you know this controversy?
Yeah, raise your hand if you know Candace Owens.
Personally or not?
I thought she was speaking out for us. She's not next week. I think that when people feel that the institutions and the people that are supposed to represent them are not, they become receptive to other voices, and those voices can be dangerous. That's a very oversimplified answer. But if people feel like even Turning Point is not speaking honestly about something like Israel, someone who comes in who might actually be anti-Semitic is going to have purchase and standing with that audience. That's what really scares me, is that, as a Jew, as someone who worries about, the future of American Judaism, the idea that the lack of credibility for people who are speaking for Jews will give an opening to people who actually don't like Jews is a very troubling trend for me. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's, the flow of information is so important. People are busy, and they get busier as their lives go on, especially as they leave college and have kids and have this. And they're just told, we're in a police department, and people who have been victims of crime will support whatever solution they are next told to solve. So like if your bike is stolen and somebody tells you more social services would have prevented that, they believe in more social services. But if they told more police would have prevented it, they support more police. If they're told the massive surveillance system, they support that. And so when people are suffering, what the volume of information that they're told and what they're told incredibly influences their political opinion. So yes, Fox News, for example, has been funneling 24/7 to millions and millions of people that all of their problems are not caused by what began in Reagan and has continued till now, this increased and now record levels of income inequality. Instead, it's your Uber Eats driver who's undocumented. That's the problem. And if they're just told it and they're not hearing anything else, why would they do it? Why wouldn't they do it?
Part of why they don't hear kind of something else is because on the Democratic side, like there are places where we're compromised with who we're taking money from. So can we really push back and point the finger at who we should be pointing it at? Even if we're saying, no, it's not, undocumented people, it's not people from the queer community who are making our lives worse. If we can't actually point at the villain collectively and not just have a few people doing it, it makes it a lot harder to kind of say something else that will make people kind of confused.
And the more media options we now have, the harder that gets. My grandfather, who raised me, watched religiously NewsHour. Do you know PBS NewsHour? It's the best news program on. And he called it Snooze Hour. He said, "Oh, it's almost time for Snooze Hour." Right? So he knew it was boring, and he watched it every day. Right? He knew it was boring, and he chose to watch it every day. That's called a diet. That's a media diet. I don't want to eat a salad ever again for the rest of my life, like ever again. But choosing to forego that, which is easy, which nothing is easier now than scrolling. Nothing. But scrolling is not healthy, both for your mental development, but also where the algorithm takes you. If we can, and there used to be this nationwide network of publishers and editors who were constantly in conflict of tension with each other, and they controlled the flow of information, and they maintained a certain level of the discourse. All of those gatekeepers are now down. Anybody can be talking to you from anywhere at any time, vetted or not, and it makes it really hard for folks to understand what's the actual cause of their pain and therefore the actual solution.
So these guys are going to be around, probably having some cider and cookies. People can engage with them. But just the final thing, if you would, the four of you would just leave us with your thought, your advice at this moment. Right? Just go around either how people should be. It doesn't even have to be, this is what you need to do. Just your final thought at this period in time, in this country's history, moving forward. Anything, please.
This may sound simple. I have become, I just think a lot about how opportunities like this when we can all sit with each other and have hopefully something that is more interesting than what is on social media kind of compete with people's attention. I think if we can start doing that at a larger scale, and if you can create opportunities, small ones even for people in your lives to come together and kind of feel what it feels like to be in community with one another, even if you're talking across difference or disagreement, but being able to do that in person and kind of taking away the additional courage that comes from being behind the keyboard, but also just hearing from real people. We know a lot of bots are filling social media platforms. I think that will have a tremendous impact on our country. I watched Join or Die, I don't know, sometime this year. And since watching it, it's just really gotten me thinking about the value of people to one another and how that can strengthen our democracy. So thank you for coming today. I think this is one of those opportunities. And yeah, I hope you all will stick around and ask more questions. And then when we leave, do this with each other.
Jeff?
I would just say support your local news outlets if you can. There's some really excellent ones here in Vermont, VT Digger and 7 Days and the NPR affiliate.
And the Bennington Banner.
And the Bennington Banner.
Thank you, Jeff.
The destruction of local news across the country is a tremendous civic crisis, and we used to have reporters who were digging through City Hall records and looking into police misconduct and investigating that kind of wrongdoing, and there are embers of something new being born, and try to keep that going because those people are doing really critical work, and if it's a small subscription you can take out or let an email to a reporter who's done a good job, I would urge you to do that.
Robert?
I come from the left side of the ledger, right? So if you're someone like me, you're not having a good time right now, right? But what I'll sort of say is that I do have a fundamental belief, while I am sort of feeling somewhat pessimistic. I do have a fundamental belief that there is just no possible way for the structures and systems to continue operating the way that they have been in order for like a pluralistic democracy to hold. And we're going to need something that is different and something that is rejuvenated and something that is that serves people better on the other side of whatever it is happening right now. And so I say that to say that it is a real opportunity to stay engaged and to be engaged, because I think the potential for building something awesome and for building a country that is more just, more fair, particularly as like AI puts a lot of economic pressure on a lot more people, is really high. And so I think that is a reason for should you be a person, which it's Bennington College, so I assume you're all with me. But should you be like me, I think it is actually a time. There is a real role for hope and collective effort on this.
Mayor, close us out.
Well, I would agree and just say that most people are not as politically involved as they think they are, which is an opportunity. There are a lot of people. Shane Gillis, the comedian, said about his dad that he watches Fox News every night until he gets angry enough to go to bed. And I think that a lot of people do the same, that they watch MSNBC and they think they're involved. They scroll and so they think they're involved, and throwing likes on social media so they think they're involved. In fact, this is what involvement looks like: starting a club, raising money, and running for office is hard, but I promise you, because everybody else is sitting home watching, you will have an impact many multiple times what you would expect. Many multiple times, because most folks are not actually engaged, so your level of engagement can sway the entire country. I've seen it before, and I think we can do it again.
Thank you all very, very much.